First off, Kal Halal Yahweh, Bashem Yahushai, Bashem Rakakwadash, Barakate Yahweh, Barakate Yahweh, Barakate Yahushai, Barakate Yahweh, Barakate Yahushai, Baharakakwadash, double honors to the apostles and elders of Great Millstone, who taught me this truth and who lead as examples to the flock. Citations also to the Akim who are pushing this word in all sincerity and all truth, and to the rest of the 1/3 men, women, and children whom the Lord has foreordained to receive mercy in these last days, and be a part of that first dominion. Now, this lesson is a lesson that I had queued up, researched up for a couple of days now. So it's gonna be based on the idea of structural adjustment programs, right, or just structural adjustment plans, and this is an economic reform plan that the IMF primarily uses, as well as the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank, but primarily the IMF, and Jamaica is one of many countries, who have taken and is still taking loans from the IMF, also from the IDB, also from the World Bank, and what I'm going to do, hopefully in this lesson through the Spirit, is to edify on what structural adjustment programs are and why they are pretty much a weapon, an economic weapon, that, so-called white man uses to ensure that so-called third world countries remain poor, remain indebted, and are unable, to come out of debt, but to only service that debt, right? So this is from investopedia.com, and the title here is structural adjustment. So I say, what is structural adjustment? It says a structural adjustment is a set of economic reforms that a country must adhere to in order to secure a loan from the IMF and or the World Bank. So before you can even get or access money from the World Bank, they're gonna put you on a structural adjustment plan or a structural adjustment program before you can even get the money. And you have to meet the goals or the requirements of the structural adjustment program before you see any money from them, right? So structural adjustment are often a set of economic policies, including reducing government spending, opening free trade, and so on. Right? Reading on, it says structural adjustments are commonly thought of as free market reforms, and they are made conditional on the assumption that they will make the nation in question more competitive and encourage economic growth, which is a total lie. This is an example of, Esau speaking, smooth words, but ultimately, pretty much effing over your economy. Right? Psalms 55, verse 20. Right? This says that he hath put forth his hands as such as be at peace with him. He hath broken his covenant. The words of his mouth were smoother than butter, but war was in his heart. And one of the ways that this man wages war is through his economy. Through his economic power. That can be structural adjustment programs, or it can be something more aggressive, such as sanctions. He said, but what was in his heart, his words were softer than oil, yet were they drawn swords. And these swords don't have to be physical weapons, but can be economic swords. So they claim that these structural adjustment plans or structural adjustment policies are for bettering the economy and making it more competitive and all these things. But as we'll go down, we'll show you that that's not the case, right? It said the IMF and World Bank, two Bretton Woods institutions that date from the 1940s, have long imposed conditions on their loans. However, the 1980s saw a concerted push to turn lending to crisis-stricken poor countries into springboards for reform, right? So it says, I'm going to go on to, right, so the structural adjustment programs have demanded that borrowing countries introduce broadly free market system coupled with fiscal restraint or occasionally outright austerity, right? So let me touch on a couple of these. So for example, it talks about free market systems. Here in Jamaica, one of the things, one of the industries that we had that was very powerful was the banana industry and the milk industry, right? Now with the milk industry, what they did was they said Jamaica had to open up to importing powdered milk, right? And when those powdered milk were imported into the country, right, because we had to open up our trade borders to that, as part of one of the IMF structural adjustment programs back, I believe in the 70s and 80s. I think it's the 80s, right? And because of that powdered milk coming in, which was obviously much cheaper than the dairy produced milk, that milk from the cows, the dairy industry in Jamaica almost was completely wiped out. The banana industry is very similar. We used to actually export banana, right? But then what? They forced us to start to accept imports, from outside, such as the Chiquita Banana Company, the Universal Fruit, United Fruit, I believe the name is, which is an American company based in South America, and that's another atrocity all in and of itself that requires a separate lesson. But these are examples of free market systems, that they enforce on you, to force you to compete on the global scale, and thus make it impossible for you to compete, impossible for you to make a profit of your native produce, And then they talk about fiscal restraint, lowering government spending, which we're going to get into a bit more, and it says outright austerity. Now, there's a definition here for austerity. Let's see if we can get it. It says the term austerity refers to a set of economic policies that a government implements in order to control public sector debt. One of that is wage freeze, which we're gonna get into. Right now, a lot of Jamaican teachers are leaving the island, nurses are leaving the island, a lot of other trained professionals, because there has been no meaningful wage increase for decades. Matter of fact, there have been wage freezes over and over, and very few times when the wages have increased, they have increased um, negligible by about like 4%, 6%, which is much lower than the rate of inflation, anyways. So essentially, you've been getting a pay cut, right? It says countries have been required to perform some combination of the following: devaluing their currency to reduce balance of payment deficits, which doesn't make any sense, right? Cutting public sector employment, right? Subsidies and other spending to reduce budget deficits, privatizing state-owned enterprises and deregulating state-controlled industries. So you know what that means? That means that whatever businesses or enterprises the government owns, and that funds the government or gives the government power or sustainability or self-sufficiency, that now has to be sold to private entities. For example, we don't own our airports. We don't own most of the hotels that are here. We don't own our power company. The water company will soon be sold, because they said that they've been operating in debt for the past 10, 11 years. So that will soon be sold. The bauxite mining that's here is not owned by Jamaica. So the majority of the resources, if not all, in Jamaica are foreign owned, right? And that's a consequence of these structural adjustment policies. You know, Easing regulations in order to attract investment from foreign businesses, meaning what? Meaning make it easy for foreign entities to invest in the country, exploit it, and move the wealth offshore, right? Closing tax loopholes and improving tax collections domestically. So, AKA, pressure your native people, the people that live in your country, tax them more in order to get income, but make it but tax the people who are investing in the country from foreign countries, tax them less, right? So make it more attractive for others to come in and set up shop, right? But tax your citizens more, which is why people always wondered, why is it so easy for the Chinese or the Indian to come here and to prosper, business wise. These are the reasons why, right? Because there are certain regulations that are put in place to make it attractive for foreigners to come and set up business here, right? Certain things like tax cuts, tax holidays, reduced taxes, stuff like that. There's an example called the what's the name of that now? Economic zone. Can't believe I can't remember the name. The company I work with is registered under the Jamaica Economic Zone, the Jamaica Special Economic Zone, right? So under that Jamaica Special Economic Zone, You know, foreign companies can register companies here in Jamaica, and they pay reduced income tax. So the business pays reduced income tax as well as other tax write-offs. So it's easier for foreign entities to set up business and prosper, and then that profit is ultimately moved offshore, but your own citizens, are being taxed more. My salary is when I get my salary, 25% of that goes to tax before I see it. So a quarter of my salary goes to tax before I see it. You know, and that's the reality for many Jamaicans, right? So it's a controversy surrounding structural adjustment. To proponents, structural adjustment encourages countries to become economically self-sufficient by creating an environment that is friendly to innovation, investment, and growth. And that's not true. You know, it says unconditional loans, according to this reason, would only initiate a cycle of dependence in which the countries in financial trouble borrow without fixing the systemic flaws that cause the financial troubles in the first place. But the structural adjustment policies that are put in place pretty much ensure that you are dependent. They actually create a cycle of dependence. So this is not true. This is Esau here being double tongued, yo. Structural adjustment programs have attracted sharp criticism, however, for imposing austerity policies on already poor nations. Critics argue that the burden of structural adjustment falls mostly heavily on women, children, and other vulnerable groups. Critics also portray conditional loans as a tool of neocolonialism. Let's look up what that is. Right? So it says the use of economic, political, cultural, or other pressures to control or influence other countries, especially former dependencies. So a lot of people in Jamaica think we are dependent, we are independent, which we're actually not. What the British did was pass off certain governing responsibilities to the island, but overall, the Queen is still head of state, you know, and the land still doesn't belong to us. The JDF is still pretty much an institution that's formed under the Governor General, which reports directly to the Queen, you know. And then there is neocolonialism, you know, which the idea of neocolonialism, as we read, is to use economic, cultural, and social, tools to pretty much influence or control poorer nations. And that's what structural adjustment programs are, right? An example of neocolonialism. It says, according to this argument, rich countries offer bailouts to poor ones, their former colonies in many cases, in exchange for reforms that open the poor countries up to exploitative investments by multinational corporations, right? Since these firms' shareholders live in rich countries, the colonial dynamics are perpetuated, albeit with nominal national sovereignty for the former colonies. All right, let's look up that word nominal. Existing in name only. Exactly. So we're independent in name only, right? Meaning it's just on paper, but in reality, in practice, we're actually not. We're not self-sufficient in no stretch of the word. You know, says enough evidence had been built from the 80s to the 2000s showing that structural adjustments often reduce the standard of living in the short term within countries adhering to them, that the IMF publicly stated it was reducing structural adjustments. This appeared to be the case through the early 2000s, but the use of structural adjustment grew to previous levels again in 2014. Right? This has raised criticism, particularly that countries under structural adjustments have less policy freedom to deal with economic shocks, while the rich lending nations can pile on public debt freely to ride out global economic storms that often originate in their markets. So, for example, go back to a case in Jamaica. Right? In Jamaica, they want to go through a public sector compensation reform. And pretty much what they're gonna do, is remove a lot of the that word keeps slipping me, allowances that are given, to public sector workers. Now in Jamaica, allowances are untaxed portions of your income, right? So your basic salary is taxed, and then you get allowances such as clothing allowance, traveling allowance, so on and so forth. All right, the idea now is to remove allowances and then lump that into your basic salary. So your basic salary is increased, however your take home pay is now less because your entire salary is now taxable because your allowances are now lumped into your basic salary. You know, so these things are happening so that what? So that government tax revenues will increase, which is what? A structural adjustment policy, as we read right here. You know, closing tax loopholes and improving tax collection domestically. You know, there's another example called KPOs. You know, let me look up that word or that term, KPO, right? Knowledge process outsourcing. So knowledge process outsourcing is the outsourcing of core information or related business activities. So in Jamaica, the BPO industry, which is business process outsourcing, is a huge industry, especially in the cities, Kingston and Montego Bay. And they're mostly made up of call centers, customer service centers. So US companies, European companies pretty much outsource their customer service to countries like Jamaica. Why? Because it's a lot cheaper. Whereas you might have to pay might have to pay an American customer service agent $25 an hour. You pay in Jamaica like less than $3. So it's a lot cheaper. So now what they want to do now is expand that to not just customer service offerings, but software development, software testing, other things that require more advanced skills. And the reason why they're doing that is because a lot of Jamaicans are getting software development jobs for US companies, European companies, and they're being paid the same as their US counterparts, European counterparts, and that's giving them a lot of money. And because those software developers are paid directly by those US entities or EU entities directly from abroad, that money does not necessarily enter the the economic um, hindsight or the economic crosshairs, I should say, of the Jamaican economy. So, meaning your government doesn't necessarily know that you're getting income. So, paying income tax is then up to you, the individual. You know. However, if KPOs are established more widely, then US and European companies know that okay, instead of hiring these developers or whatever directly, we can set up a company within Jamaica, register it under the special economic zone, get tax breaks and other tax write-offs, and also we don't have to pay the developers as much. We can pay them half as much, a third as much, so that saves us money. And then the government now in turn, Jamaican government in turn then is able to collect more money, because they will know those companies that are set up in Jamaica now are obligated to pay tax for us. So therefore, our salary is taxed before we even get it. So that again improves the tax collection domestically for Jamaica and also what improves close tax loopholes. You know, I've been talking for a while. Let me get a couple precepts. This is Proverbs 22 verse 7. It says the rich ruleth over the poor, and the borrower is a servant to the lender. Right? That's plain and to the point. This is Isaiah 10 and 1. Woe to them that decree unrighteous decrees, that write grievousnesses which they have prescribed. And what we've been explaining from the start of the video, it's unrighteous decrees and their grievousnesses, right? It says to turn aside the needy from judgment and to take away the right from the poor of my people, that widows may be their prey and that they may rob the fatherless. Let's read another one before we get back into it. All right, it says, shall I count them pure with the wicked balances, with the bag of deceitful weights? For the rich men thereof are full of violence, and the inhabitants thereof have spoken lies, and their tongue and their tongue is deceitful in their mouth. Right? Now, this is an article from The Guardian back from 2013. It says Jamaica's decades of debt are damaging its future. Right? The latest IMF loan does not quote unquote rescue Jamaica, whose debt must be written off if its people are to take control of their economy, which the elite will never do. They'll never write off the debt of the country. And even if they do, the economic damage that's been done to Jamaica so far will pretty much make it go right back to the same situation that it was in before. Right? Many people in Jamaica would have trembled as they read the financial press last week telling them that their country is again due to be rescued, quote unquote, by a loan package put together by the IMF. Over 40 years, Jamaica has been rescued, quote unquote, on countless occasions. In the 1980s, the island became almost a byword for structural adjustment. Jamaica is one of the most indebted countries, spending twice as much on debt repayments as it does on education and health combined. And if you can't spend on education, you can't spend on health, then what? Your country will never develop and you will forever stay poor. And incidentally, those are two of the biggest sectors where brain drain is coming from. Nurses, which is education, nurses, which is health. So nurses and doctors are leaving in droves, you know, and teachers and principals, and that's from what? Education, right? It says, and looks set to miss several Millennium Development Goals. After 4 decades of austerity, the country has a few lessons for the likes of Greece, Portugal, and Ireland. The IMF has announced $1 billion loan to help, quote unquote, Jamaica meet huge debt payments in coming years. So pretty much the loan that we took, the $1 billion loan that we took back in 2013 or 2014, was to what? Was to help to pay debt that we already owed. So you borrow more money to service the debt that you already have, making yourself more indebted. So you keep on borrowing money to service the debt that you already have. And then you continue to borrow money to service the new debt that you take on to pay for the old debt. As usual, the loan is to be accompanied by 4 years of austerity. Precise details still pending, though our wage freeze amounting to a 20% real-time cut in wages. So, for example, back in 2013, when this happened, there was a wage freeze for all public sector workers for years. So I think it was like 4 or 5 years, right? Inflation per year, they averaged out here at about 4 or 5%. So by the end of that 4 years, your pay has in real terms, decreased by 20%. That's a fifth of its value, right? So that's what happens when you implement a wage freeze. That's actually a pay cut, right? And then after that, after those years of austerity passed, so that would have been around about 2018, 2019, when the government finally agreed to wage increases. The wage increases were by 4%, right? So pretty much the pay cut is still around about 16%, right? And that's a conservative estimate, right? He said the austerity will be applied to an economy that has effectively not grown since 1990, right? So I'll post the article in the description for brothers who want to read it. But I'm just going to read a couple more precepts and then, wrap up. All right. I believe we just have one precept left. This is Ecclesiasticus 21:8. He that buildeth his house with other men's money is like one that gathereth himself stones for the tomb of his burial. So if you keep building with somebody else's money, which is what Jamaica has done for decades now, building or trying to build with IMF's money, we're pretty much burying ourselves, yo. Right? So hopefully this lesson was edifying. I know it was, a lot to bring out. Hopefully it was edifying, brothers and sisters. Stuck it out. Till next time, shalom.